All right. Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. Tonight, we're not going to be talking about any CDs or vinyl or cassettes or anything like that. We're going to be talking about some books and magazines. A couple of folks have sent me some things recently, so part of this video is a thank you for some VCLT stuff. Although, again, it's not really vinyl stuff that's been sent around, some reading material instead. And then the second part of the video, I'll be doing a quick book review for something that was recently published that other folks might be interested in checking out sometime this holiday season. Maybe you want to add it to your Christmas wish list. Maybe you just want to pick up a gift for yourself so that you've got something to read if you have a little off time where you've got time to catch up on some reading during the holidays. All right, first off, some thank yous. As Craig Zoller sent a couple of books my way. Craig's done a couple of the heavy metallurgy streams with Marty and I recently. By the time this video goes up, I think we will have just completed the Blue Oyster Cult deep dive. And so Craig sent along a couple of things for me to check out. One of them was Tolkien's The Children of Húrin book that was published, I believe, just earlier this year. This is one of Tolkien's longer tales from the First Age of Middle-earth, which is thousands and thousands of years before the stories that take place in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It's a nice read. It's a pretty easy read, sort of, a tragic, romantic, fantasy story. Definitely one of Tolkien's longer standalone tales from that period of Middle-earth's history. This tale has been published in some other forms before. I know I have at least one Tolkien collection somewhere that has a version of The Children of Húrin in it. It isn't the same version here. I think this has extra material that wasn't included in that draft. That's one of the things when you get into Tolkien's different unpublished works. He often had multiple drafts that were sometimes done years apart and could be different in a lot of the details. So very cool to see this version of the story. Thanks to Craig for sending that along. Craig also sent this. It's a collection of some works by Clark Ashton Smith, one of his favorite sci-fi fantasy authors, and one that I've just never got around to checking out. Smith is usually associated with folks like Lovecraft and Robert Howard. They were kind of the three classic weird tales writers in the 1930s. And yeah, I've read lots of Lovecraft. I enjoy his stuff a lot. I've read a little bit of Howard's material. I'm not as keen on the Conan stuff, to be honest. But this one I just never had come across any of Clark Ashton Smith stuff. And so this collects the tales on the futuristic continent of Zothique. So again, Craig, thank you very much for sending these. I've finished The Children of Húrin. I've just started this one, so I don't really have anything to say on this one at this time. Because I need some more stuff to read, Marty also sent a pile of some older fanzines my way. So thank you very much for these, Marty. We've got, most of these are from around 1999, 2000 time frame. There may be a little variation on that, but there's an older issue of Snake Pit. We've got several issues of a zine I never came across back in the day, but looks pretty good. It's called Battle Helm. Looks like it was published in Minnesota. This one has a story on Thor. If you don't remember Thor, don't feel bad. Not many people do, but basically just take everything about Manowar and shove it all into one person instead of spread across 4 band members, and you've got the right idea. Kind of cool that they've got a Thor guitar pick glued to the cover of the issue. There's a few other Battle Helms here. They seem to have had pretty good coverage. A lot of definitely known bands. These weren't just covering local scene kind of stuff for smaller acts. So be interesting to flip through those a little bit more as time allows. And let's see, there's also an issue of Leather Knights, The Third Crusade. Don't know this one either. I think this one also had a Minnesota contact address in it, if I remember right. And finally, an issue of Transcending the Mundane. This is a zine I do remember from back then. I don't think I ever got any issues of it, but I remember it being mentioned here and there over time. So, Marty, very cool. Thank you very much, sir. be flipping through those and reading a little bit here and there. Reading old zines can always be a little tricky, just because you always have to keep in mind that if you're reading an article about, say, creator was on the cover of one of those, it's creator being interviewed in 2000, 22 years ago. So that it's like, oh, wait, they're not talking about, oh, well, it's because that didn't happen until 2006 or something. All right. So again, appreciate the reading material quite a bit, guys. It's always good to have a few things to read. For myself during the holidays, sometimes you get a couple of long car trips to go visit family and friends. Sometimes you're stuck at relative's house for a couple of days, and it's like, yeah, I'm pretty content just to find a good chair and curl up in the corner here and read for a bit while the kids run off and play, and the other adults do boring stuff. But let's get on to kind of the main topic for tonight. Picked up this book recently. It's called Denim and Leather: The Rise and Fall of the New Wave of British Heavy Metal. It's authored by Michael Hahn, who is a writer for The Guardian. He's an independent writer. He's worked with The Guardian publication in the UK in the past for their music content. He's basically a new wave of British heavy metal fan. He wasn't involved directly in the scene at the time, other than just enjoying the music. This is a Bazillion Points edition. My understanding is this book was published a year or so earlier in the UK and perhaps Europe, and then it's been licensed by Bazillion Points, but this is an updated edition. There's additional pictures and additional material. It sounds like maybe some mistakes were corrected and got a few extra things ironed out for this extra edition. This just came out here in November 2022, so I had it pre-ordered. Arrived right on time, and I just have finished reading it in the past couple of days. So I wanted to sit on it for at least a couple of days, and kind of collect my thoughts, and figured I would share them with others. A couple of folks I've mentioned, to that I was reading this book were pretty excited, like, oh, well, let us know what you think of it. So that's what we're going to do. First thing to note with the book is that there's very little material that's actually written by Michael himself. The book is almost completely cover to cover, just different interview clips from different movers and shakers on the scene that are spliced together by topic. So, for example, there's a chapter on Venom where he interviews, the three Venom characters one at a time, and then has, their, quotes from their interviews kind of, spliced together, and then also has interview clips from other people, different music journalists, members of other bands, and they're kind of throwing in their 2 cents about Venom in the Venom chapter. The chapters are a little different. It's not a chapter per band. In fact, only a couple of bands get their own chapter. There's a chapter on Venom, there's a chapter on Diamond Head. There's essentially a chapter on Def Leppard towards the end, although it's not exclusively about Def Leppard. It's pretty close. Other chapters, though, have to deal with just other aspects of the scene. There's a chapter, for example, that focuses heavily on, Neil Kay and, the Soundhouse scene. There's a chapter on Neat Records and some of the goings on with that particular label, since it was a very central one to it all. There's a chapter on, the female bands and, kind of, the role of women on the new wave of British heavy metal scene. So it focuses more heavily on Girl School and Rock Goddess. And those were about the only two there were. So a lot of Girl School and Rock Goddess. But yeah, there's very few places where Hahn ever writes anything, himself. There's an introduction to the book, of course. There's a short afterward. And really the only other time you hear from Hahn is with a few editorial notes here and there. And I'll explain those in a minute or two. So yeah, most of the time you're just getting, this chapter covers this topic and you just jump right in. Opening a random page here, you have, some quotes from Jess Cox, who was, the leader of Tigers of Pantang. Right after that, you have, thoughts from Tom Warrior, Thomas Gabriel Fisher, as a fan, he was interviewed and gives his thoughts on some of it. Then you have quotes after that from someone named Keith Conn Harris, who was a fan and is quoted in here as a fan / sociologist / writer. After that, you have a quote from Brian Slagel, so giving his 2 cents on it. This isn't an unusual way for these kind of music history books to be written. I've got a bunch of them on the shelf behind me, and a lot of them are written in this style. It's a style popularized by books like Please Kill Me, documenting the punk scene in the 70s and stuff. The advantage to this kind of style is that you're hearing directly from the people who were there and kind of at the center of the movement, which is a huge plus. You're not hearing Michael Hahn's take on what Paul Di'Anno said. You're just, here's the quotes from Paul Di'Anno. I don't really need to explain them, just read them yourself. So this kind of delivery is really nice for that. You're kind of getting it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Where this kind of delivery can be difficult is that you have to keep it organized very well, or it can get confusing or become a bit of a slog to get through sometimes. And there are some chapters that do get a little bogged down in this book, just to be fair. There are some times that you feel like, all right, you've probably had a few too many quotes on this one point. They're getting extremely redundant by the time you've heard the fourth or fifth person say the exact same thing. There are also times where very similar quotes will come up, but in different chapters, because you've got chapters organized around different types of topics or themes. Sometimes quotes that were important to mention when you were talking about influences in the earliest part of the new wave of British heavy metal. Now you get several chapters later where they're talking about, the first time they saw Saxon, and you hear kind of the same points brought back up. And you're thinking, wait, should this clip maybe have been in that other chapter? I guess it kind of works here too, but it starts to feel like some of this material I've already read in this book, or I've read material very similar a few chapters earlier. So there is a little bit of repetition that can happen with this particular style of putting a book together. Again, I think overall the approach is worth it, but you have to handle it just right. And there are a few missteps in here for that. Overall, I think, though, that the book does a pretty good job delivering. In terms of who all is interviewed, it's the folks that Michael Hahn could get access to. There are a lot of central characters you'd want to hear from. Biff Bifford from Saxon, some of the other Saxon guys, Steve Dawson's interviewed a lot. Guys from Raven, all three of the guys from Venom are talked to. Most of Girls' School are interviewed for the book. You get a couple of guys from Diamond Head. Paul Di'Anno, I think, is the only one from Iron Maiden. Dennis Stratton may have a few quotes in here too. Again, as you can see, pretty thick book, and after a while, the names can start to run together. There's a lot of material with Joe Elliott and Rick Savage from Def Leppard. Neil Kay has a lot of interviews in here. So there's a pretty good cross section. A lot of the bigger names you'd want to see. Kevin Riddles from Angel Witch is talked to in several chapters. Rob Rare from Tigers of Pantang. There are some noticeable absences. You don't have anyone like Bruce Dickinson or Steve Harris in the book from Iron Maiden. You don't have Jeff Barton, who is one of the famous music journalists most associated with new wave of British heavy metal. In most cases, these are not surprises. Iron Maiden kind of left new wave of British heavy metal behind long, long ago and aren't really keen to tie themselves back to it. The few quotes I've seen from people like Bruce Dickinson in more recent years have been pretty dismissive and kind of slag on the whole new wave of British heavy metal thing a little bit. Same is true for Jeff Barton's absence. Barton famously wants nothing to do with the scene and hasn't for a very long time, so he's flat out refuses to talk to anybody about it whatsoever. That's his choice. Seems a bit of a shame, but whatever. There are several other music journalists who were active on the scene at the time who are interviewed in here very extensively. So you still get a very good perspective from the British music press back in the day. So even though Barton himself isn't interviewed, you still have that perspective very well represented. Other things to note with the book. Some chapters, I think, do come together much better than others. Especially in some of the first couple of chapters, it feels a little tough getting off the ground in the book, but it eventually finds its stride. And so by the time you're halfway through the book and going through the end, the chapters just feel like they kind of are a bit more cohesive, and the different quotations and sections work really well together. One thing that's nice in a lot of the chapters that I do like is when particular stories or anecdotes come up, and that's what this book does focus on quite a bit, is just tell us what it was like at the time. A lot of these interviews are done 40-ish years after the fact. Details can be forgotten or misremembered. Memories get a bit fuzzy and such. And so in a lot of cases, if there were points of contention, Michael did a nice job of having quotes from different people who do remember it differently. So you can see that this story that you just read from character A, well, that's how character A remembers it. But right below that, you'll have a quote from character B saying, actually, that's not how I recall that. I recall it being this way. And so you can see that, all right, well, we're not sure which of these two versions is true. Maybe it's somewhere in between. But it helps illuminate that we shouldn't take every one of these anecdotes as, carved into stone. That, yeah, there are some disagreements about the details on some things. One example of this, one of the sections where he's interviewing Kronos, Kronos mentions at one point he and the other guys in Venom were very pissed off about being labeled as heavy metal because one of the major music publications that month had Bon Jovi on the cover of their heavy metal edition. And he was sort of ranting and raving about that. But then it's clarified afterwards that, this interview with Kronos, this time period he's talking about is like, 82, 83. But Bon Jovi wasn't on the cover of any of those magazines in 82 or 83. He didn't appear on the cover of an issue for that magazine until more like 1984, 1985. And that's where some of the little editorial additions from Han comes in. If there were things that he could fact check and confirm, like, well, actually, this isn't the right date. They're saying this happened in 82, but actually, every other source has it listed as not occurring until like late 83. That's where you get, a few editorial inserts from Michael Hahn to help clarify things that could be double checked and confirmed as, well, the story might be right, but they've got the dates wrong, or the story's interesting, but it actually happened, in Newcastle instead of Birmingham. They got their dates on the tour mixed up or something. So it is nice to see those kind of clarifications and to get the different points of view on some of the different stories. This is a book that you do read for the stories. Unlike some other styles of rock music over the time, there's not been a lot of new wave of British heavy metal written about all in one place. You tend to get very short interview snippets with like one band member in one CD booklet, or one person is talked to just a little bit for a quick interview that's published in some zine somewhere. So it is very nice to have a big collection of these kind of tales and anecdotes all in one place, so that you can get a little more feel for the characters involved and a little more depth to what's going on at the time. It's also nice because it gives you a lot of perspective about what was this going on with the scene and what it was like beyond just the recorded music. For folks like myself who are much too young to have been present, I mean, I was on the wrong continent, I was the wrong age. A lot of us never got to witness any of this stuff happening in real time. And as such, all we have, or most of what we have, to base our thoughts and opinions on are the records, the singles, the compilations, the albums that were put out. There's not a ton of live footage from back in those days. And what is, a lot of times, the sound or picture quality is very, very poor. A lot of the new wave of British heavy metal was happening before music videos were a thing. So you don't have that kind of archive to go back and look at either. You really often just have the music. So it is pretty interesting to have, a pretty nice thick slab of the stories that go along with those bands, so that you can actually see what was going on. For example, in the chapter on Diamond Head, they talk a lot about how Diamond Head was obviously well received, and most people had them pegged as the band that was going to be the breakout success of the whole movement. Why didn't that happen? it never really has gotten discussed in any other of the CD inserts or anything I've read, but in here they kind of go through a lot of it were issues with the band's management, that they were essentially being managed by Sean Harris's mother and father and or stepfather, mother's boyfriend, some kind of relationship there. And that while they had the band's best interests at heart, they didn't screw them over or steal from them or anything like that. They weren't music managers at all. It was his mom and her boyfriend, and they didn't really know the music industry at all. And as such, they missed a lot of opportunities to try to help Diamond Head get to the next level. And as such, they kind of sputtered out and died. Those are the kinds of things that, yeah, you can learn more details about in this kind of setting. That's never going to be explained in detail in the liner notes to a Diamond Head reissue package or anything. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting things to learn about the new wave of British heavy metal scene in the book. One thing I thought particularly interesting, kind of the last example I give, towards the end, there's an extensive section about Def Leppard, and something I didn't mention before, but I should bring up here. Some of the interviews used in here are not recent ones done by Hahn himself. A lot of them are, and he's very clear about which ones are his interviews done like in 2019, 2020. But in some cases, he did have to use interviews that people had given back in the day. For example, there are some Jeff Barton quotes in here, but they are just taken directly from his old written articles for Sounds and Krang. But they are all clearly labeled, and the introduction to the book points out very clearly, like, here, I didn't get to interview this person, but they did a really good interview on the subject with somebody else in 2016, and I am using quotes from that interview with permissions. Right? So that's important to note. Getting back to the example with Def Leppard. So yeah, there's a lot of interview material in here from Joe Elliott. He comes across, as very well spoken and having a very good memory about stuff. Def Leppard famously have distanced themselves from the new wave of British heavy metal almost since the first album came out. That they obviously came up during that time, played beside some of the other bands and such, but they've never wanted to be tagged that way. I've always assumed a big part of that was bands in general don't like being put in genres. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I'm not a musician. I don't have that point of view. But bands always seem to hate being called, oh, you're a death metal band. Oh, you're a melodic death metal band. Oh, you're a DSBM band. Oh, you're a new wave of British heavy metal band. And Def Leppard have always been like, no, we weren't. No, we never were. Which always felt a little bit shitty of them because it seems a little crappy to deny your roots, even if you quickly moved beyond that. But there's a couple of interesting things related to that come up in one of the later chapters. There's a particularly telling quote from Elliott. He's very congenial in here. He's not slagging on other bands or anything like that. But he does make the point out one time regarding this whole labeling of the scene that he explains in terms of, well, Def Leppard, we just felt like, we were trying to be a bit more ambitious. We had our eyes on, sort of a much bigger picture thing, not just wanting to play pub scenes and stuff. And he's like, and so we really didn't want to be lumped in as part of that scene because as soon as you're strongly tied to a scene, you live and die when the scene lives and dies. And it's very strongly, then kind of, made clear that they understood the new wave of British heavy metal wasn't something that was going to last forever. There are several examples quoted in that chapter that even by 1982, a lot of people felt like the scene was getting oversaturated and overdone and burning out a bit. Yeah, and from the perspective of Joe Elliott and his bandmates, at least as he's explaining it in this interview long after the fact, they kind of thought, if everyone just thinks of us as a new wave of British heavy metal band, as soon as this fad is over, then we're over. So we want to get out of that label, away from that as quickly as possible, so that when it eventually kind of, has its day in the sun and the music press turns to something else, we don't go down with the ship. So that was very interesting. The other thing that's interesting towards the end of the book is that a lot of the interview clips that Hahn mentions, and he even does mention this himself in the afterword, he pins a lot of the demise of new wave of British heavy metal on Def Leppard in particular, but especially the Pyromania album. And this is something I have not heard articulated before, and I hadn't really thought about. Pyromania came out in 1983. The new wave of British heavy metal was still a thing at that point. Pyromania, it's a little before my time, in terms of, my own age. I'm a Hysteria child. Hysteria was the Def Leppard album that was a thing when me and my friends were coming of age enough to be listening to some music on the radio. So, and again, there's a several year gap between Hysteria and Pyromania. So yeah, Pyromania has never quite, resonated the same way with me as it does with folks who are about 5 years older than me. But they talk a lot about the making of Pyromania in here, how, it was a very meticulous process. The band had a very clear vision of what they wanted to do. They worked very closely with Mutt Lange and the studio to get particular sound, put it together. This is when they swapped out guitarists, with Pete Willis not really being able to cut it at the time. And the bottom line was, of course, it was a smashing success of an album. It went absolutely ballistic in terms of sales, especially in the American market. And I think the number they quoted was that, the best-selling rock album from 1982 had moved about 2 million copies. Pyromania had sold 6 million copies before the year was even over. So it was really successful on a staggering level. They were also starting to reap the benefits of video play on MTV. They got on board with that and made good use of it very quickly, even with videos shot for the High and Dry album had already gotten the band worked up to a really good status in the US before Pyromania was even released. What that has to do with the new wave of British heavy metal, though, is, from the perspective of some of the folks in the book and Michael himself, is that it kind of just destroyed the mystique around the new wave of British heavy metal. New wave of British heavy metal was very much about, the small guy, you and your buds from your local neighborhood in your city being able to go out and do it yourself. Put together a few gigs on your own, get your own single put out there. Yeah, maybe get the interest of a small label and put out an album on your own with a small, modest budget. And then all of a sudden, the attention turns to, nope, that's not how you do it at all. If you want to really make it in the music business, you need a £700,000 recording budget to make Pyromania. You need Mutt Lange, a huge, high-profile producer to make Pyromania. You need, one of these, international top of the business management teams to get you Pyromania. Pyromania, in their perspective, became the blueprint for how you make a successful rock album. This business of printing up 1,000 copies of a single on your own and selling it at a few gigs here and there was more of the, oh, that's kind of cute, but that's not how you do it now. Record labels, also, of course, were noticing all this, like, okay, we want a piece of that kind of action. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, these other bands and labels are thinking, are we supposed to do that too? And it is around the time you start seeing some of those new wave of British heavy metal bands do their second albums. And a lot of times, the second albums were very watered down and much more commercial sounding. Jaguars, this time, being just, the poster child for completely losing the plot compared to the first heavy album. But there you go. They're seeing Pyromania go absolutely nuclear in terms of popularity. But those bands don't have the same resources. They didn't have, the, top-notch, global management team to help them get to the next level. They weren't being handed £700,000. That's the conversion rate pre-Brexit was usually about £2 to $1. So you're talking like, $1.4 million, very roughly. Some of these bands were being given like, maybe $20,000 and like get the album done as fast as you can. Who's my producer? I don't know. This guy who just works at the studio. Who's doing our cover art? I don't know. Get your girlfriend to draw something. They didn't have the resources to do those kind of albums. And maybe they really didn't have the same ambition or the same kind of goal of world conquest deeply ingrained in them the way that Def Leppard proclaims that they did. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting perspective that they really see it as, Pyromania is responsible for really ending the new wave of British heavy metal in a lot of ways. That after that, bands were chasing the Pyromania sound, or, they do point this out too. By 83, you're also starting to get Metallica and other bands who have been influenced by new wave of British heavy metal. You're getting Hellhammer material and stuff like that. The fans of new wave of British heavy metal were doing their own bands, and some of those bands were much, much heavier, much faster. You were getting things that were going to quickly become speed metal and thrash metal. But a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, either by their own choice, by management's urging, by record label demands, they were being forced in the Pyromania direction. They were going towards the less heavy sound, but they didn't have the resources available to them to be successful on that same level. And, Pyromania was setting the bar up here. If your album ends up being way down here, that's it. You were kind of toast. And a lot of the bands started falling by the wayside very quick. So kind of an interesting take. Last thing I'll say here, I've rambled on long enough, but something to point out for those who are curious. The book does not include a ton of interviews with people from smaller or lesser known bands. If you're wanting, extensive insights, from, the bass player from Big Daisy, or you're hoping that Virtue gets some page length here, and there's a 1,000-word essay about, how great Sapphire was. This is not the book you're looking for. Again, most of the folks interviewed in here, it's more guys from Samson. Thunderstick is interviewed quite a bit. It's people in the more recognizable bands, not the folks who, like from Hollow Ground or those kind of acts that really maybe just had the one single put out and then disappeared into the ether. So at the end of the day, I found it a very good read. It's an interesting read. I'm very glad I did it. I will probably go back through and read it again at some point. Not right away. I'll put it aside for a while, but it will probably get at least a second read through. It does have a few minor issues. I guess one last issue I didn't mention. I do not like the chapter titles. They all tended to use kind of quirky quotes that he had gotten from guys. It feels like a very British thing to do, that you want your, chapters titled things like, "Oh, we must have done a lot for Peru." Chortle, that's funny. It doesn't tell you a damn thing about what's going to be in that chapter. So it's going to be a little hard in the future when I'm looking for, like, okay, where was that anecdote about Raven recording themselves taking a crap and recording it backwards and hiding it on one of their records? Was that the Peru chapter? Or was it the chapter, called "The Singer Swallowed a Bee and He Carried On"? I would have liked the chapter titles to be more descriptive so that it'd be easier to look things up in the future in the book. May have to add a few footnotes myself to that. But if it sounds like this is something you would enjoy reading, it's available through Bazillion Points Press. It's only $24.95 as of the time of this recording. So that is not bad at all for a book of this size and this much detail. And again, covering a topic that not a lot of other new wave of British heavy metal books you can sit down and read that are written from a similar point of view. So, end of the day, good book. I would recommend it to fans of the genre. It's a good buy at that price point. And I hope this interview has helped you get some insight on whether or not this is something that you would want to read, or maybe it's just not for you. And with that, let's go ahead and wrap things up. So, let's talk metal in the comments down below. What is going to be on your reading list for the holidays? Again, there's usually a little downtime where you can snuggle up next to the Christmas tree or the Yule log or the menorah, whatever it is you're decorating with. Anything particular that you've been reading lately, whether it's music related or not, that you think other folks might enjoy, if they need something to fill in some of those quieter hours as we work our way through the holiday season. All right, with that, let's call this to an end. Everybody take care, and as always, keep banging your head. But don't do it while you're trying to read a book, because that just gives you a headache. That's no good at all. So keep your head steady while you read the book. Bang it when you listen to the music.